Hello, everybody, and welcome to the June 2022 Microsoft Patch Tuesday webcast. This month, Microsoft have fixed 55 vulnerabilities, of which 3 were critical in nature, 51 were rated important, and the 1 remaining was marked as moderate. We had fixes for Microsoft Windows operating system, .NET Framework, Visual Studio, Microsoft Edge. We had fixes for SharePoint, as well as Windows Defender, LDAP, PowerShell. We also had a couple of updates for Windows 7 and Server 2008, including R2 for anyone who is still subscribing to the ESU license, which is in its third and final year for Windows 7, and there will be 1 more year for Server 2008. Now, this month, we don't have any weaponized or public aware threats to worry about. However, CVE 2022-30190, known as Felina, is still being reported as weaponized. Now, the approved workaround can be applied via Syxsense Enterprise to disable the Windows Support Diagnostic tool completely. And I'm going to talk more about that in just a few minutes. Now, from the 55 fixes that we had, let's talk about how we're going to prioritize those in your environment to help you deploy the most essential updates as quickly as possible. Now, we're going to use 6 factors. 6 factors are going to help us to prioritize the fixes for deployment. Firstly, we're going to use the vendor severity, which typically starts off at critical, high, medium, and low. And the CVSS score, which is the independently assigned score out of 10, 10 being the worst, 0 being the least. When you combine the two, you have a more transparent severity to which to prioritize. So we'd like to have the two, as it ensures that if the vendor does knock down the severity a little bit, the industry brings it back up again. Second, we have 2 statuses against the vulnerability. A weaponized status indicates that the vulnerability is being exploited. It's being exploited by hackers, by organizations and countries that are simply trying to access your network to steal data or to deliver payloads such as ransomware. Public aware vulnerabilities mean that the precise method to exploit is available. And this comes typically via bug bounty programs where somebody will find a vulnerability, ask the vendor to resolve it. The vendor may choose not to resolve the vulnerability in that time period, simply because to exploit it may be very, very difficult. Public aware does not mean it's weaponized, though. However, a vulnerability that is weaponized and public aware, like the Felina, should be ultra prioritized because it means there's active exploits in the industry. Now, to balance this, we have countermeasures. Now, countermeasures come in 2 forms. We bundle them both together. We have a workaround. A workaround can be issued by the vendor to make a change, such as to stop a service or to use group policy, to apply a change to Windows. And that's a way of getting around the vulnerability. You're not closing the vulnerability with a patch, but you're applying something that effectively negates the need to deploy it. We always recommend, however, if you are applying a workaround, to always continue to deploy the patch. Please make extra attention for the vendors on the vendor's website if they recommend you remove the workaround once you apply the patch. The other countermeasure is called a mitigation, and that's something that means you don't need to deploy. You may have an ultra sophisticated antivirus, or you may have perimeter protection that's actually able to safeguard your environment from that kind of attack. Lastly, we use your exposure. We can combine the previous 5 plus this one to give you a priority in your own unique environment. So using Syxsense, we take these 6 factors and we can show you which of the patches you should be prioritizing over all of the others by using all of those 6 factors combined. Now, since we don't have access to your environment, we've chosen a couple of updates that we'd like to talk about today. 5 in total. One of these actually includes 2 fixes. The first one, as we mentioned, is the Microsoft Support Diagnostic tool vulnerability known as Felina. Then we have a network file system remote code execution vulnerability, 2 SharePoint vulnerabilities to talk about, a Hyper-V, and a Kerberos AppContainer vulnerability. So let's talk about the first one. So the first one, as we mentioned, was released about a week and a half to 2 weeks ago. And a vulnerability in the Windows Support Diagnostic tool can allow an attacker to exploit arbitrary code with privileges from the calling application. So for example, from Microsoft Word. Now, the remote code execution vulnerability exists when MSDT is calling a URL protocol from that application, such as Word. And the attacker can install programs, view and change or delete data, or in fact, create new accounts under the context of the user that's launched that process. So if that is an admin on the machine that unfortunately was exploited, they could actually end up creating new admin accounts. And that Easter egg approach is used in quite a lot of other vulnerabilities, not just ransomware, but with SolarWinds as well. Now, if we take a look at the risk that we have here, which is these 9 factors down below, we have a CVSS score of 7.8, which is actually really bad. But you do need local network access, and that's good. So this does somewhat reduce the risk to a local-based attack. Attack complexity is low, privileges required is none, user interaction is required, that's good. And the scope, which we call the jump point, is unchanged, which means no, it cannot be used to launch into another technology. This is our number 1 recommendation for today. The second is CVE 2022-30136. And this is a Windows Network File System remote code execution vulnerability. Now, this vulnerability could be exploited over the network by making an unauthenticated, specially crafted call to a network file system service to trigger the remote execution vulnerability. It exists due to insufficient validation of user-supplied input in the Windows network file system, and a remote attacker can use a specially crafted call to execute that arbitrary code. That arbitrary code could in fact cause a denial of service to the server to take it down. Now this has a CVSS score of 9.8, which is really bad. The vendor has issued a critical severity for it. As we mentioned earlier, this is not yet weaponized and is not yet public aware, but there is a countermeasure. Now the vulnerability is not exploitable in NFS version 2 or 3. So prior to upgrading your version of Windows that protects against this vulnerability, Microsoft is recommending that you disable NFS 4.1 if you have it. However, they've got a caveat. They said that this could adversely affect your ecosystem and should only be used as a temporary mitigation. So in this scenario, if you're applying this countermeasure, deploy the update and then reverse the countermeasure. Now, this vulnerability has an attack vector of network. So network meaning anything that is on a network, including internet. Attack complexity is low. Privilege required is none. User interaction is none. And the scope, thankfully, is unchanged. So this cannot jump from this technology to another. My next one is CVE 2022-30157 and 30158. These two vulnerabilities affect Microsoft SharePoint. There is a remote code execution vulnerability here. Now, the vulnerability exists due to insufficient validation of user-supplied input in Microsoft SharePoint, similar to the previous, and if exploited, a remote attacker could pass specially crafted input to SharePoint and execute arbitrary code on the targeted system. This is rated as important from Microsoft with a CVSS score of 8.8. There is no countermeasure, unfortunately. Now, the attack vector is network, meaning any network including internet, with low attack complexity, none privileges, none user interaction, and thankfully also, again, we have an unchanged scope. So this vulnerability cannot be used to jump from one technology to another. However, the next two were not so lucky. CVE 2022-30163 is the Hyper-V remote code execution vulnerability. Now this one, I'm in favor of using hypervisor because it creates a sandbox from my company laptop to the operating system that will access my company's network resources. So if ever I need to access a server, I will always do so from within that hypervisor. And I know many companies since COVID are using the same as an air-gapped approach to safeguarding their company network. Now, this particular vulnerability exists due to a race condition in Hyper-V. Now, to exploit this vulnerability, an attacker could run a specially crafted application on Hyper-V guest that could cause the Hyper-V host operating system to execute arbitrary code. Microsoft have suggested the attack complexity is high. However, this threat also includes a scope change, meaning that if this could be exploited, an attacker could escape from the guest to the host. In this case, a successful attack could be performed from a low privilege Hyper-V guest, and the attack could traverse the guest's security boundary to execute code on the Hyper-V host. It's really, really bad. Now, this can be attacked over any network, including internet, has a CVSS score of 8.5, a vendor severity of critical. Attack complexity is high, as I mentioned. Privileges required is low, no user interaction, but there is a scope change. So this ability to jump from one technology to another is actually what's probably increased the CVSS score substantially. And lastly, Kerberos AppContainer, CVE 2022-30164. Now, an attacker could bypass Kerberos service ticketing, which performs user access control. So we are familiar with Kerberos from a domain logon and an AD logon. And Kerberos is that system that protects logons to make sure that you are allowed to access your network. Now, a low privilege attacker could execute a script within the app container to request a service ticket and thereby gain elevation to the service privilege, and this also has a scope change. In this case, a successful attack could be performed from a low privilege app container, and the attacker could elevate their privileges and execute code or access resources at a higher integrity level than that of the app container itself. Now, Microsoft has issued an important vulnerability severity, but a CVSS score of 8.4, which is still bad. It's not as high, I believe, because the attack vector is local. So again, you need to have local access to the device, but it does have low attack complexity, low privileges required, no user interaction, but it does also have a scope change. So if this was to be exploited, they would be able to jump from this technology into any other tools on the device itself. Now, a full write-up of all the other vulnerabilities that have been released by Microsoft are available on our website. So if you head over to syxsense.com/news, there is a page dedicated for Patch Tuesday, along with our other webinars and masterclasses. If you'd like to head over to syxsense.com, you can subscribe to receive those updates each and every month, or every time we upload new content, such as out-of-band or weaponized vulnerabilities in the industry. I really want to say thank you for joining us today. And if anyone has any questions or comments or suggestions for improvement, please feel free to send us an email or find us on Facebook. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.